Roll Credits, the spotlight is on Christopher Nolan, a filmmaker who turned complex ideas, practical filmmaking, and massive cinematic ambition into one of the most recognizable directing styles in modern cinema. Welcome to Roll Credits, where movie lovers get the trivia they didn't know they needed. This podcast was created with help from AI tools, so double-check any quotes before you drop trivia at your next movie night.
Absolutely. Always double check.
Right. So, usually when you look at a clock, there's this comforting certainty to it, right? It just ticks forward. 1 second seamlessly follows the next. It's linear. It's safe.
Yeah, I mean, time is basically the one inescapable constant for all of us. We're all just moving in one direction at the exact same speed toward the exact same inevitable end. It's completely rigid.
But then you step into a movie theater, the lights go down, and suddenly that clock is completely broken. The hands start spinning backward, or like a single minute stretches into an agonizing hour, or time just folds in on itself entirely.
Like a piece of paper.
Exactly. You aren't just watching a story anymore. You're stepping into this temporal landscape that is entirely subjective. And that is exactly what we're digging into today.
It's going to be a massive journey.
It really is. Our mission for you on this deep dive is to unpack a huge stack of sources. We've got production diaries, behind-the-scenes documentaries, academic essays.
Right.
We are going to trace how a kid with a Super 8 camera built this massive cinematic empire.
Alongside his wife and producer, Emma Thomas, which is a detail we definitely need to get into.
Oh, totally. We are completely bypassing the basic plot summaries you probably already know. Instead, we're diving straight into the technical rigors, the narrative gambles, and just the sheer audacity of a director who, treats a movie screen like a chalkboard for quantum physics.
I love that description because when you look at his entire filmography, from the absolute lowest budget indie all the way to the billion-dollar blockbusters, he's constantly having this relentless conversation with the audience.
About reality itself, right?
Yeah, exactly. About the nature of reality. And the mechanics of how he forces us to question that reality started incredibly early. Like really early.
Yeah, I was reading that his obsession began when he was just 7 or 8 years old?
Yeah, around 7 or 8.
So he had an American mother and an English father, and for his birthday, they gave him a Super 8 camera. And like a lot of kids in the 1970s, he started shooting stop-motion films with his action figures.
Which sounds cute, right?
It does. But let's pause here because I don't think people realize how technically demanding stop-motion actually is for an 8-year-old. You don't just point the camera and hit record.
Not at all. Stop motion inherently forces you to deconstruct time. I mean, standard film runs at 24 frames per second. So to create just 1 single second of movement with the toy, you have to physically pose it, click the shutter for 1 frame, move it a fraction of an inch, click again, and repeat that 24 times.
Wow, just for 1 second.
Yeah. It is this painstakingly tactile way to learn filmmaking. When you're doing that, you're literally holding time in your hands. It teaches you early on that pacing and reality in cinema are constructed illusions.
Because you control the flow.
You completely control.
And his imagination was just being completely fired up by the science fiction of the era, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know he's talking about being heavily influenced by Star Wars in 1977.
Star Wars was huge for him, yeah. But the real turning point, like the true cinematic awakening, happened a little later. He watched Ridley Scott's Blade Runner on VHS and then Alien.
Oh, classic.
Right. And our sources note this is when he had a profound realization about what he called the mind of a film.
What does that mean exactly? The mind of a film.
Well, he realized that there was a single controlling intelligence dictating the entire aesthetic. When you're a teenager watching these dense, atmospheric movies, you don't know the technical jargon. You probably don't know the term mise en scène.
Right. Okay, let's unpack that term really quickly for anyone who hasn't taken a Film 101 class.
Yeah.
Because film critics love to throw it around. Mise en scène essentially just means everything that appears within the frame of the camera, right?
Precisely. It translates from French as placing on stage. So it encompasses the set design, the lighting, where the actors are placed, the costumes, even the shadows.
Everything you see.
Everything. And Nolan realized that directing wasn't just, telling actors where to stand and reciting lines. It was about total, uncompromising control over that entire visual composition. Ridley Scott taught him that the atmosphere is just as important as the script.
And what's wild is that he didn't even take the traditional route to master that composition. Like, he bypassed film school entirely.
He did. He went to University College London, UCL, to study English literature instead.
But here's where the story gets its real anchor. On his very first night in the residence halls, he meets a woman studying ancient history named Emma Thomas.
Which is just incredible timing. Nolan himself later joked that the biggest lesson from university is to pay a lot of attention to who you meet on your first night.
Seriously. She would become his wife, but maybe more importantly for cinema history, she became his singular producing partner.
They basically became inseparable, and they essentially commandeered the UCL Film Society.
I love their approach to funding their own education, by the way. It's so brilliant. They would screen 35mm second-run movies for the student body, take the profits from those ticket sales, and use that cash to fund their own 16mm short films.
It was pure grassroots filmmaking. There was no course tutor telling them what to do, no strict curriculum.
Just figuring it out as they go.
Exactly. And those early shorts are basically the Rosetta Stone for his whole style.
Yeah.
Take Tarantella from 1989. It's this fascinating piece of lost media. It aired exactly once on a public television show. It's only about 4 minutes long, and it features his brother, Jonathan Nolan, having these intense nightmares about spiders.
And Christopher Nolan actually acts in it, doesn't he?
He does. He plays this strange, villainous figure making visitations in the dream.
Which is so funny to picture. I know fans have hunted for this footage for years, but it's completely tied up in copyright issues. But what stands out to me isn't just how rare it is, it's the thematic through line. Even back in 1989, he's already playing with this uncanny inability to distinguish between a dream and reality.
Oh, absolutely. The seeds were all there. Then you look at Larceny in 1996, which is an 8-minute short that's screened at the Cambridge Film Festival. Nolan still holds the rights and flat out refuses to release it widely.
Why is that?
Probably just perfectionism. But based on accounts from the cast, particularly Jeremy Theobald, it's an apartment burglary thriller with a massive plot twist at the end.
Typical Nolan.
Right. But the premise actually came from a real event. Nolan had his own flat broken into, and he was struck by this very specific, unsettling realization. The only thing keeping people out wasn't the physical lock or the wooden door. It was just the fragile social protocols we all agree to.
Which is such a dark, hyper-analytical way to look at a burglary. I mean, most people just want their TV back, and he's having this full-blown existential crisis about the social contract.
That's how his brain works. And that psychological bend brings us to his most famous early short, Doodlebug, in 1997.
Oh, Doodlebug. It's a 3-minute black and white thriller about a man frantically trying to squash a bug in his apartment. He finally smashes it with his shoe, only to realize the bug is a miniature version of himself.
And then in the final shot, a giant shoe comes down from above to squash him. It's this endless recursive loop.
It's so trippy. But I want to push back a little here. It's incredibly easy for us to sit here with the benefit of hindsight and say, wow, a 3-minute film about a recursive loop is pure genius.
Yeah.
But isn't it true that pretty much every film student makes weird, existential, black and white shorts? I mean, what actually separated him from the pack at UCL?
That's a fair point. What separated him was his extreme, almost punishing technical rigor. A lot of student films are sloppy, right? They rely on happy accidents.
Yeah, just pointing the camera and hoping for the best.
Exactly. But Nolan was methodical. He mastered the mechanics of the camera. He learned how to manipulate f-stops.
And f-stop is the aperture setting, right?
Right. It dictates exactly how much light hits the film. A wider f-stop lets in more light, but gives you a shallow depth of field, blurring the background. A narrower f-stop requires massive amounts of light, but keeps everything crisp.
So when you have zero budget and you can't afford massive movie lights, you are forced to make very specific choices.
Exactly the point. He treated his limitations not as compromises, but as deliberate stylistic tools. When you shoot on black and white film, you have a lot more latitude with exposure. So high contrast lighting, harsh shadows and bright highlights hides the cheapness of your sets. It looks incredibly stylish, like a classic film noir, rather than just looking like a cheap student film shot in a messy dorm room.
Right, it looks intentional.
Yeah.
And that rigorous mathematical approach to limitations culminated in his debut feature, Following, in 1998.
Produced by Emma Thomas, of course.
On an absolute shoestring budget. They shot on 16mm black and white film, and because everyone had day jobs, they could only shoot 1 day a week. I read it took them almost a year to finish.
And this is where we really see the birth of his incredible efficiency on set. 16mm film stock is brutally expensive. You have to buy the physical rolls, pay for the chemical processing, pay for the telecine transfer. Every single second the camera is rolling is draining your bank account.
So you can't just do 20 takes.
No way. So Nolan utilized a technique called dry takes.
Meaning they rehearsed without actually rolling the camera.
Right, but to an extreme degree. He would have the actors rehearse for 6 months. He was essentially treating the film like a stage play. When they finally got to a location, which was usually just a friend's apartment, they would run a scene they had already practiced 100 times. And Nolan would capture it in one, maybe two takes, using only available natural light.
That is insane discipline. But the real revelation of following wasn't even the budget, it was the timeline. His fascination with nonlinear storytelling was actually born out of sheer logistical necessity on this film.
Yeah, this is such a great detail.
Right. He actually wrote the script for Following completely chronologically. But because they were shooting it in these sporadic, disconnected weekend chunks over an entire year, continuity became a nightmare. Actors' haircuts would change, they'd lose access to locations. So he had to physically chop the script up on the page to accommodate the reality of the shoot.
He was basically forced to make it nonlinear in the editing room. And through that really painful editing process, he discovered that rewriting a linear narrative to make it nonlinear in post-production is incredibly clunky.
It just doesn't work naturally.
No, it doesn't. The lesson he learned was that you can't just shuffle the deck later. The nonlinear structure has to be baked into the very DNA of the script from page one.
So, for his next project, he decides to completely reverse that process. Sure. He takes a short story written by his brother Jonathan and constructs this grassroots, independent film that just demands the attention of the entire cinematic world.
Memento.
Memento. Let's talk about the mechanics of Memento. Look, if you're listening to this deep dive, you probably know the premise of Memento. Guy Pearce plays Leonard Shelby, a man with anterograde amnesia who uses tattoos and Polaroids to track his wife's killer. We don't need to rehash the basic plot.
We all know about the tattoos.
Right. What we really need to dissect is the sheer cinematic engineering of how this film actually functions. Because applying that lesson he learned from Following, Nolan wrote the script for Memento strictly chronologically. But then he reorganized it into a non-linear puzzle in the editing phase. Apparently, he never looked at it in chronological order ever again.
The structure is just a marvel. You have two interwoven storylines happening at the same time. The black and white sequences move forward in chronological order, and they function like objective, isolated film noir setups where Leonard is just alone in his motel room on the phone.
Okay, and then the color sequences.
The color sequences move completely backward in time.
Which is incredibly dangerous from a storytelling perspective. It can so easily turn into unwatchable, disorienting chaos. But this is where Dodie Dorn, the film's editor, executed just a masterclass in audience psychology. She anchored this chaotic timeline using traditional continuity editing.
Specifically, match-on-action cuts.
Let's explain what that is. A match-on-action cut is a fundamental editing technique where you cut from one shot to another view that matches the first shot's action perfectly. So like if I start opening a door in a wide shot, the editor cuts to a close-up of my hand turning the knob at the exact same moment in the movement.
It creates a seamless flow for the eye.
Exactly. So in Memento, Dorn used this to stitch the reverse timeline together. A color scene ends with Leonard in the middle of a physical action, say, getting punched or running. The next color scene we see, which is chronologically the scene that happened before the one we just watched, ends by catching up to that exact same punch or that exact same run.
It provides this subconscious anchor. The viewer always knows how the scenes mechanically link up, even if they are entirely disoriented about the larger plot.
It's so smart. Now, if we look at the neuroscience here, the backward timeline is a brilliant narrative device. But we should probably clarify that this is not how anterograde amnesia actually works in the real world.
Oh, definitely not. You don't experience life in reverse chunks just because you can't form new memories. From a purely neurological standpoint, it's a gimmick.
Right, but it serves a profound narrative purpose.
It does. Think about it. If the film were told chronologically, the audience would figure out the mystery of Teddy and Natalie's manipulation immediately. We would constantly be 5 steps ahead of Leonard, just watching him stumble around.
Which is frustrating as a viewer.
Exactly. By reversing the structure, Nolan forces us into Leonard's psychological shoes. When Leonard walks into a room, he doesn't know how he got there or why he is holding a weapon. And because of the reverse structure, we don't know either. We experience his terrifying lack of context in real time.
It's the ultimate puzzle box film. You aren't just passively eating popcorn, you are consuming the text in an active interpretive mode. It raises these massive philosophical questions about the malleability of memory, right? It's a terrifying look at how we all subconsciously edit and reinterpret our pasts to justify our current actions.
And David Julian's audio design reinforces that psychological split perfectly. He created what he called brooding classical synth tones for the black and white sequences to give a sense of objective isolation. But for the color sequences, the sound design becomes oppressive, heavily layered, and rumbly.
It mirrors Leonard's fragmented, paranoid state of mind. So Memento was a massive indie breakout, and it immediately caught the attention of Steven Soderbergh, who championed Nolan to Warner Bros. This led to his first major Hollywood studio film in 2002, Insomnia, which was a remake of a Norwegian thriller.
Starring Al Pacino and Robin Williams.
And here is what I find fascinating. He is suddenly working with legendary, massive movie stars that can absolutely crush an indie director. I mean, how did he handle that transition to studio politics?
He didn't just handle it, he actually used the studio resources to push his visual psychology even further. So the plot involves Pacino as a veteran detective who accidentally shoots his partner in a perpetually sunlit Alaskan town while hunting a killer played by Robin Williams. The sun literally never sets, which induces a crippling insomnia in Pacino's character.
Right, the endless daylight.
To visualize this, Nolan and his director of photography, Wally Fester, devised incredibly meticulous lighting techniques. Feister actually had a background in shooting late-night Cinemax movies, where you have to work fast and create moody lighting on the fly.
Oh, that's a funny connection.
Yeah. They would have Pacino in a dim, heavily shadowed room trying to sleep, and suddenly they would hit him with intense, blazing blasts of light slicing through the window blinds. It perfectly simulated the physical, jarring agony of sleep deprivation.
And think about Pacino's acting challenge here. Movies are almost always shot out of sequence based on location availability. So Nolan was asking Pacino to play a man with 0 days of sleep deprivation on, like a Tuesday morning, then jump to playing a man with 5 days of sleep deprivation on a Wednesday afternoon, and then dial it back to 2 days of deprivation on a Thursday.
He had to chart this incredibly nuanced, nonlinear descent into madness completely out of order.
That is wild. And then you contrast that with Robin Williams' performance. There's a chilling scene where Williams' character is on the phone, calmly describing his murder to Pacino. A standard director would just use a voiceover, right? Just let Williams' audio play over Pacino's reaction.
But instead, Nolan used these rapid, almost silent, violent cut-ins of the murder, as Williams describes it. It forcefully bridges the psychological gap between the killer reliving the act and the detective visualizing it.
It's like he was handed the keys to a Ferrari with Insomnia. He has the studio budget, he has Pacino, he has Williams, but instead of taking it for a joyride and churning out a standard 90s thriller, he meticulously took apart the engine, piece by piece, just to see how the mechanics of a studio production actually work.
He proved he could handle massive egos and massive budgets.
Which led Warner Bros. To hand him the keys to Gotham City. Let's look at how he reinvented the blockbuster. Because before Batman Begins in 2005, the superhero genre was in a very strange, campy place. We had just come off the neon rubber nipples of Batman and Robin.
Yeah, not the genre's finest hour.
No. But Nolan brought this concept of tactile realism to the franchise. He wanted everything to feel grounded, functional, and deeply physical.
And tactile realism isn't just an aesthetic, it's a completely different production philosophy. It means avoiding CGI whenever humanly possible.
I mean, he literally designed the Tumbler, his version of the Batmobile, in his own garage using model kits. He didn't just draw a cool picture, he kit-bashed model cars together because he wanted to figure out how the suspension would mechanically function in the real world.
He needs to know it works.
Exactly. And my absolute favorite anecdote from the production of Batman Begins is how they handled lighting the CGI bats. Because they did have to use some CGI for the massive bat swarms in the cave. But he wanted the post-production visual effects team to know exactly how light bounced off a real bat in that specific environment.
So what did he do?
He had a freeze-dried bat mounted on a stick, and they would hold it up on set in front of the camera as a lighting reference.
A freeze-dried bat on a stick. That is an absurd level of granular dedication.
Isn't it? And when we transitioned to The Dark Knight in 2008, you see his influences expanding far beyond comic books. He wasn't looking at Superman or Spider-Man.
No, he was heavily referencing Michael Mann's sprawling, grounded crime epic Heat and Fritz Lang's 1933 masterpiece, The Testament of Dr. Mabuse. He treated Gotham not as a gothic fairy tale with gargoyles, but as a modern, brutalist American city.
Heavily modeling the architecture on Chicago.
Exactly.
The casting process and performances in that movie are legendary, specifically Heath Ledger's Joker. We all know the impact of that performance, but the physical crafting of it is so interesting. Ledger insisted on applying his own Joker lipstick.
Really? She did it himself?
Yeah, he argued that the character himself would do it haphazardly with his own hands, getting it on his fingers and smearing it. They looked at the distorted, agonizing art of Francis Bacon as a visual reference for how the makeup and scars should warp his face.
That makes so much sense when you look at the final design.
It does. There's also that hilarious casting mix-up years later when Anne Hathaway came in to audition for The Dark Knight Rises.
Yeah.
She completely misread the situation, thought she was auditioning for Harley Quinn, and came in dressed up in this manic, chaotic outfit.
Well,
Yeah, only to realize mid-meeting she was supposed to be reading for the sleek, composed Catwoman.
that's amazing. But returning to the mechanics of his practical filmmaking, I think the defining moment of The Dark Knight is the 18-wheeler truck flip.
Oh, iconic.
Right. But they didn't do this in a desert or on a computer. They went into the middle of the financial district in Chicago, built a massive nitrogen piston system into the trailer of a real semi-truck, and physically blew it end over end down the street.
In the middle of the city.
Yes. Chris Corbould, the special effects supervisor, was so nervous about the physics of this stunt, worrying the truck might drift and smash into a skyscraper, that he actually hid in a side alley during the take.
He couldn't even watch it.
He couldn't bear to watch it. He just listened for the crash to know if the physics calculations were correct.
That is terrifying. Now, interwoven right in the middle of these massive Batman films, in 2006, Nolan releases The Prestige. It stars Hugh Jackman and Christian Bale as dueling Victorian magicians, with David Bowie perfectly cast as the legendary inventor Nikola Tesla.
The Prestige is arguably the skeleton key to understanding Christopher Nolan's entire philosophy of art. The film is a meta-commentary on the filmmaking process itself.
No, so?
The structure of the narrative literally mimics a magic trick, as Michael Caine's character outlines at the very beginning. You have the pledge, showing the audience something ordinary, the turn, making it do something extraordinary, and finally, the prestige, bringing it back, complete with a shocking twist. Nolan structures the entire film, and arguably his entire career, on this exact three-act deception.
The film tracks diaries inside of diaries, completely misleading the audience. But here's the tension that always fascinates me about Nolan. On one hand, he is doing these hyper-grounded Batman movies talking about tactile realism and building real cars.
Right.
But at the exact same time, he shoots The Prestige, which hinges on a literal sci-fi cloning machine built by David Bowie in the woods of Colorado.
Right.
How does he reconcile those two extremes? Gritty realism on one side and magical cloning machines on the other.
Well, he reconciles them through his absolute commitment to treating absurd concepts with deadly seriousness. He takes a fantastical sci-fi premise, a cloning machine, and grounds it in the harsh mechanical reality of the physical world. The machine isn't presented as whimsical magic. It's a terrifying, loud, burdensome piece of electrical engineering. It throws dangerous sparks. It requires massive generators.
It feels dangerous.
Exactly. And furthermore, the themes of the film doubles self-deception and sacrificing one's normal life for the sake of the trick perfectly mirror the obsessive dedication of being an auteur. Hugh Jackman's character literally murders a clone of himself every single night just to hear the applause of the audience. Christian Bale's character shares his entire existence with a secret twin, destroying his marriage and his sanity in the process. It's an incredibly dark look at the psychological cost of manufacturing awe.
Wow, that's heavy. And that bridge between grounded realism and impossible sci-fi sets the stage perfectly for his biggest gambles. In 2010, fresh off the billion-dollar success of The Dark Knight, Warner Bros. Basically gives Nolan a blank check to make a highly complex original dream heist movie, Inception.
A massive gamble.
Huge. Again, you probably know the plot. Leonardo DiCaprio is Cobb, infiltrating the subconscious minds of corporate targets. But what I find fascinating is the absolute panic behind the scenes. Lee Smith, the film's brilliant editor, and Nolan spent weeks in the edit bay absolutely terrified.
Why were they panicking?
They thought they had accidentally made an incomprehensible, enormously expensive art film that mainstream audiences would entirely reject.
I mean, they were terrified because the mechanics of the narrative were so incredibly dense. But Nolan's saving grace is how he visualizes abstract concepts. When we think of dreams in cinema, we usually think of surrealism, right? Salvador Dali's melting clocks, illogical transitions, floating objects.
Yeah, just weird floaty stuff.
But Nolan rejects that entirely. In Inception, dreams are literal architecture. They are logical, exact, and bound by physical rules.
Now this drew some criticism. As our sources point out, even Nolan's own daughter noted, That's not what dreams are actually like.
It's true. Nolan admits he did almost no research into actual REM sleep or the neuroscience of dreaming. Because he isn't interested in actual sleep, he is using the dream space as a narrative vehicle to explore his ultimate obsession, time dilation.
The time dilation mechanics in Inception are brilliant. It's like a video game with different server speeds. If you are in level 1 of the dream, 5 minutes there equates to a full hour of time in level 2. As they go deeper into the subconscious levels, time stretches out exponentially.
So a 10-hour flight in reality means a week in level 1, 6 months in level 2, and 10 years in level 3. It takes an abstract psychological concept and maps it onto rigid mathematical rules so the audience can actually track the heist.
And this reliance on strict, logical rules for fantastical concepts escalates dramatically in 2014 with Interstellar. Matthew McConaughey plays a pilot who has to travel through a wormhole to find a new home for humanity, leaving his daughter behind on a dying Earth.
But the stakes aren't about distance. They are about time. Because of the massive gravitational pull of a supermassive black hole called Gargantua, time moves incredibly slowly for McConaughey's character.
For every hour he spends on a planet near the black hole, 7 years pass back on Earth.
To ensure the physics held up to scrutiny, Nolan worked intimately with Kip Thorne, a theoretical physicist who would later win a Nobel Prize.
No way, a Nobel Prize winner.
Yes. They wanted Gargantua to be the most scientifically accurate depiction of a black hole ever put on screen. Thorne generated pages of equations detailing the gravitational lensing of light, and the visual effects team built entirely new rendering software to compute it. Their simulations were so accurate, they essentially predicted what a black hole looked like years before the Event Horizon telescope captured the first real image of one.
That is mind-blowing. Though, we should note, they did make one aesthetic compromise for the sake of the audience. In reality, the Doppler effect would make the approaching side of the black hole's rotating accretion disk look brighter and bluish-white, while the receding side would be dimmer and red.
Right. But Nolan chose to switch off the Doppler effect visually in the final render. He kept the black hole symmetrical and glowing golden. Why? Because the scientifically accurate version looked lopsided and visually confusing, and he didn't want the audience distracted by an astrophysics lesson when they were supposed to be feeling the emotional weight of the scene.
Which perfectly illustrates his balance. Science must serve the cinema, not the other way around. Because the true core of both Inception and Interstellar isn't the physics at all, it's the emotion. Both films are ultimately about fathers desperately trying to traverse impossible distances, whether through subconscious dreams or across galaxies to get back to their children.
Yeah, that emotional core is everything. The ending of Inception builds up to that famous spinning top. Is it real or is he still dreaming? Does it fall?
Great debate.
Yeah, exactly. But the brilliance of the ending isn't the ambiguity. It's that Cobb spins the top, sees his kids, and walks away. He doesn't wait to see if it falls. He no longer cares about objective reality. His subjective reality being with his children is all that matters.
And in Interstellar, the climax involves the Tesseract. How do you visualize the fifth dimension? Nolan creates a visually literal 4D construct behind his daughter's bookcase, allowing McConaughey to interact with time as a physical spatial dimension. It's the visual manifestation of the idea that love and gravity are the only forces capable of transcending time and space.
We also have to dive into the soundscapes here because his collaborations with composer Hans Zimmer completely rewired the industry's approach to sound design. Inception gave us that massive, blaring brass horn sound, often called the Brayum, that ended up in every single movie trailer for the next decade.
Oh, the Brayum, you couldn't escape it.
You really couldn't. But during these collaborations, Zimmer made an incredibly insightful comment. He told Nolan, the sounds keep getting bigger and bigger, which makes the images look faker and faker.
That is a staggering realization. If the music sounds like a 100-piece orchestra in a pristine studio, but you are watching a gritty, handheld camera shot of a guy running through the snow, your brain registers a disconnect.
Exactly. Nolan realized that if he was going to shoot practically, without green screens, using natural light and real locations, he needed the sound mix to feel equally grounded, messy, and aggressive.
Which led to his highly controversial sound mixing techniques. This really kicked off with Interstellar. The naturalistic, booming environmental sounds rattling spacecrafts, howling wind, and Zimmer's massive organs often completely drown out the dialogue.
It was a very deliberate, calculated choice. He prioritizes the visceral, physical feeling of a scene over narrative exposition. You aren't supposed to hear every word. You are supposed to feel the vibration of the ship tearing apart.
Well, if Inception and Interstellar were about expanding time, stretching it out into limbo or across the galaxy, his next films were about compressing time and literally weaponizing it. In 2017, Nolan takes on World War II with Dunkirk. And, typical of his style, he completely avoids the standard war movie tropes.
No generals in war rooms pushing pieces around maps.
No Winston Churchill smoking a cigar and giving expositional speeches. He wanted to focus entirely on the subjective, collective experience of survival on the beaches of France.
So he structures the film using a triptych, 3 overlapping timelines, each moving at a completely different speed. The soldiers on the land, waiting for rescue, are tracked over 1 agonizing week. The civilian boats crossing the sea to save them are tracked over 1 urgent day. And Tom Hardy's Spitfire pilot in the air, providing cover, is tracked over just 1 frantic hour.
And to tie these disparate timelines together, to make a week feel as fast as an hour and an hour feel as grueling as a week, Nolan and Zimmer utilized an auditory illusion known as the Shepard tone.
The Shepard tone is so effective.
Let's break down the mechanics of the Shepard tone for a second. It's an auditory illusion created by layering separate tones separated by octaves. As it plays, the highest pitched tone gets quieter, the middle tone stays constant, and the lowest pitch gets louder. It tricks a human ear into perceiving a pitch that is constantly, infinitely rising. It feels like it's building to a crescendo, but never actually peaks. It just keeps ascending forever.
It creates this constant anxiety, and Nolan is so obsessed with structure that he actually wrote the screenplay for Dunkirk to mathematically mirror that Shepard tone illusion. As the film cuts between the land, sea, and air timelines, the action always seems to be building to a massive climax, but the edit cuts away just before the release.
So the tension is unending, ratcheting tighter and tighter until the very final moments of the film.
The pressure is only finally released when we hear a stirring, muted rendition of Elgar's Nimrod.
It's an incredibly effective use of structure to physically induce anxiety in the audience. But if Dunkirk was about overlapping timelines, his 2020 film Tenet decided to just break time over its knee. Tenet is an espionage action thriller revolving around inverted entropy.
Yeah, John David Washington and Robert Pattinson navigate a world where objects and people can move backward through time while the rest of the world moves forward.
Which is just, it dunts my brain to think about.
Nolan actually worked with Kip Thorne again to base this in the concepts of reversible entropy and the second law of thermodynamics. It's the idea that time's arrow is dictated by the flow of entropy, and if you can reverse the entropy of an object, you reverse its flow through time. But translating theoretical thermodynamics to the screen created absolute logistical nightmares for the production crew.
I mean, I can't even imagine the choreography. There's a sequence in an Oslo Freeport where the protagonist fights an inverted enemy. How do you actually film a fight where one person's punching forward through time and the other person is absorbing punches backward through time?
It was a monumental task for stunt coordinator George Caudle. He called the first weeks of shooting a baptism of fire. They actually had to study complex dance choreography to map it out.
So it's more like a dance than a fight.
Basically, John David Washington essentially had to learn the entire complex fight sequence in 4 different variations. He had to learn it moving forward naturally, he had to learn to perform the moves backward physically, and he had to learn it from the perspective of both characters in the fight because, spoiler alert, he is eventually fighting his own inverted self.
That sounds exhausting. And the camera operators had to shoot at different frame rates depending on whose perspective we were following. But the behind-the-scenes reality of the inverted car chase on the highway is even crazier. Yeah, critics have definitely pointed out these scientific paradoxes here. For instance, an inverted person would need to bring their own oxygen because normal air wouldn't pass through their inverted lungs properly, which the film addresses with the masks, right? But scientifically, they would also need to bring their own light because inverted light photons would bounce backward into the sun.
Exactly.
And practically speaking, an inverted car wouldn't just sit on the highway waiting for a reverse driver to uncrash it.
Which brings up a very vocal criticism of Tenet. Many critics argued that Nolan finally disappeared up his own wormhole here. They felt he sacrificed emotional resonance and narrative coherence purely for the sake of an unfilmable puzzle. Nolan himself even said in an interview with Stephen Colbert, "You're not meant to understand everything in Tenet. It's not all comprehensible."
So if a director openly admits you can't understand the movie on a first watch, is that a failure of storytelling? Or is he asking us to experience cinema in a totally different way? Like, are we supposed to ride it like a visceral roller coaster ride rather than reading it like a novel?
It's a massive demand on the audience. If you need a whiteboard and a diagram to understand a film's basic plot, traditional storytelling has definitely taken a back seat to conceptual experimentation. But on the other hand, whether Tenet worked for everyone or not, it pushed practical in-camera filmmaking to its absolute physical limits. He literally visualized theoretical thermodynamics using real stuntmen, real cars, and a real 747 crashing into a building.
And pushing those physical limits perfectly set him up for a project that required the grandest, most terrifying scale of all, splitting the atom. Oppenheimer. In 2023, Nolan releases a 3-hour, R-rated, $100 million biographical film about J. Robert Oppenheimer, starring Cillian Murphy. On paper, pitching a 3-hour movie mostly consisting of men talking in small rooms about quantum mechanics sounds like a massive financial risk.
Massive!
But it went on to cross $1 billion at the global box office and completely swept the Academy Awards.
By defying every conventional rule of modern Hollywood biopics. He avoided the standard cradle-to-grave biopic traps by returning to his mastery of genre and structure. He actually envisioned the film in 3 distinct acts. The first act is an origin story of a genius. The second act, the building of the atomic bomb at Los Alamos, functions precisely as a heist movie gathering a team of experts in a race against time and the Nazis.
I never thought of it as a heist movie, but that fits perfectly.
Doesn't it? And then the third act is a tense, claustrophobic courtroom drama. He knew that heist movies and courtroom dramas inherently force audiences to lean in, pay attention to the details, and listen to every word of jargon.
And the visual contrasts were staggering. He shot the 1954 security clearance hearings in a tiny, 7-foot-wide room to create a suffocating sense of claustrophobia, while the 1959 Senate confirmation hearings were grand, theatrical, and exposed. To achieve this visual fidelity, he pushed the limits of the IMAX format.
Which is standard for him at this point.
Right. Because he shoots on massive 65mm and 70mm film stock, he needed a way to shoot the objective timeline in black and white. But 65mm black and white film didn't exist.
It literally wasn't a thing.
So he actually went to Kodak and got them to invent and chemically engineer 65mm black and white large format film specifically for this production.
That is just wild. And his director of photography, Hoyt van Hoytema, made incredibly deliberate choices with the camera movement. They shot the film without using a Steadicam. A Steadicam gives you that smooth, floating, almost dreamlike movement you see in a lot of modern films.
So what did they use instead?
They used heavy dollies on metal tracks, heavily inspired by Sidney Lumet's 1965 film The Hill. This gave the camera an incredibly grounded, intentional, heavy weight. Every move feels deliberate and burdensome.
But the most Nolan challenge of the entire film was how to depict the microscopic world of quantum physics and the eventual splitting of the atom without using CGI. How do you practically show wave-particle duality to an audience?
When Nolan spoke with physicists during his research, they told him that quantum physics is impossible to visualize accurately because it's not just tiny ping-pong balls spinning around each other, it's overlapping energy fields and probabilities. So Nolan realized that the solution wasn't visual effects. The solution was editing.
Right. He went back to the roots of early Soviet cinema techniques, specifically Sergei Eisenstein's montage theory. Let's explain that for a second. Montage theory is the idea that shot A plus shot B creates a completely new idea, C, in the mind of the viewer. If I show you a shot of a man looking off screen and then cut to a shot of a bowl of soup, you assume the man is hungry.
Exactly.
The hunger isn't in either shot. The hunger is created in the cut.
Precisely. Nolan realized that by rapidly cutting together practical, analog images of spinning sparks, vibrating metal, and bursts of light, which were created practically by his visual effects supervisor, Andrew Jackson, using aquariums and aluminum flakes, he could create the feeling of quantum mechanics in the audience's mind. The physics exist in the frantic cuts between the frames, simulating the terrifying, vibrating energy of the microscopic world.
We also have to mention the historical context woven into the film. Nolan adapted the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography American Prometheus, which heavily details Oppenheimer's ties to communist circles and the subsequent McCarthy-era witch hunts. The film presents these historical realities and associations strictly as narrative context to explore his downfall.
We should be clear for you listening that the film doesn't really take a stance. It's an intricate look at the machinery of bureaucracy crushing the individual, presenting the history as it occurred.
Yeah, it operates as a profound, tragic irony. The man who gave America the ultimate weapon to end the war is subsequently destroyed by the very political apparatus he helped empower. Cillian Murphy's ability to portray that internal psychological weight, letting the guilt and horror play entirely behind his eyes, won him the Best Actor Oscar.
Well deserved.
Which brings us to those Oscars and the undeniable power of partnership. Nolan won Best Director, noting in his speech that cinema is just over 100 years old, and being a meaningful part of its history means the world to him. But the award for Best Picture was accepted by Emma Thomas.
Her acceptance speech was incredibly telling about their dynamic. She emphasized that the film was what it was because of Christopher Nolan, calling him singular and brilliant. But Nolan himself, in his own speech, immediately redirected the praise, thanking Emma and calling her the producer of all his films and all their children.
It is impossible to overstate her role in this empire. She has produced every single feature he has ever directed, from shooting, following on weekends, to coordinating the detonation of a real explosive for Oppenheimer. She manages the impossible logistics, grounds his craziest ideas in practical reality, and simultaneously raised their 4 children.
In fact, their daughter Flora actually has a terrifying cameo in Oppenheimer.
Oh, she does.
Yeah, she plays the young girl whose face horrifically melts away in Oppenheimer's vision of the bomb's aftermath.
Talk about a family business. They built this cinematic empire entirely together, side by side. And their partnership was recently recognized at the highest possible level when they were given honors from the King at Buckingham Palace, a knighthood for Nolan and a damehood for Thomas for their extraordinary services to film.
It's an amazing trajectory.
So, having conquered the historical biopic, having swept the Academy Awards, and having proved that a dense adult historical drama can make $1 billion in the summer box office without a superhero in sight, what mountains are possibly left for Sir Christopher Nolan to climb?
Well, let's look ahead to 2026. He is taking on perhaps the most foundational story in Western literature, Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey.
This is a staggering undertaking. It has a reported budget of $250 million, and it's being filmed entirely on IMAX 70mm cameras. I read they are reportedly using over 2 million feet of film.
The cast is a massive, sprawling ensemble. Matt Damon is starring as the Greek king Odysseus, desperately trying to return home to Ithaca after the Trojan War. Anne Hathaway plays his wife, Penelope, fending off suitors. And they are joined by Tom Holland, Robert Pattinson, Zendaya, and Lupita Nyong'o.
Before this was officially announced, the secrecy surrounding the project led to some of the wildest internet rumors I have ever seen. People were convinced he was making a 1920s vampire movie.
A vampire movie?
Yeah. Then there was a rumor it was a reboot of the 80s helicopter action movie Blue Thunder. Some even thought it was an adaptation of the 60s spy show The Prisoner, which he was actually attached to way back in 2009.
Nolan actually admitted he found the wild rumors highly entertaining, but the reality is much more ambitious. He noted in interviews that there has been an odd gap in movie history where The Odyssey hasn't received a massive modern Hollywood studio adaptation.
To prepare, he didn't just read one version. He studied multiple translations of the ancient text, including versions by Emily Wilson, Evie Rue, and Robert Fagles, to understand the nuances of the mythology.
And if we connect this back to his career trajectory, this project is actually 20 years in the making. Decades ago, Nolan was offered the chance to direct the movie Troy, which was based on the Iliad. But he felt he was in a little over his head at the time. He didn't think he had the logistical mastery to handle a Bronze Age epic, so he passed and made Batman Begins as a sort of consolation prize.
A pretty good consolation prize.
Right. But now, with decades of massive logistical experience under his belt, he finally feels ready to tackle the Homeric epics.
But how he is adapting it is uniquely Nolan. He is applying that signature tactile realism to Greek mythology. He was heavily inspired by Ray Harryhausen's classic stop-motion special effects films and Akira Kurosawa's sweeping historical epic Ran.
But wait, I know we're saving the full deep dive into the production of The Odyssey for a future deep dive once it releases, but just briefly, how do you apply tactile realism to a story with literal sirens, witches, and cyclops? Are we going to see a guy in a giant practical eye costume?
Far from it. Nolan explicitly decided against casting actors as Greek gods throwing glowing CGI lightning bolts from Mount Olympus. Instead, he is depicting the presence and wrath of the gods through terrifying natural phenomena. Massive storms, tidal waves, eclipses, things that ancient people would have genuinely believed were supernatural interventions. It's about the fear of the gods, which makes it much more psychologically immersive.
That's a brilliant approach.
And the production design reflects that brutal realism. Costume designer Ellen Moroznik and production designer Ruth de Jong did exhaustive research into the fragmentary archaeological records of the actual Bronze Age. For instance, to show the elevated status of characters like Agamemnon, they didn't just use shiny gold plastic. They used materials that were genuinely difficult to obtain back then, like blackened bronze, raw silver, and sulfur. It's about grounding the myth in the dirt, sweat, and metal of ancient history.
It sounds absolutely incredible, and it brings our journey today full circle. We started by talking about a kid in the 1970s holding a Super 8 camera, painstakingly moving action figures fraction by fraction to create a few seconds of illusion. Now, he is a knighted master of cinema, commanding hundreds of millions of dollars, running 2 million feet of IMAX film through massive cameras, and attempting to adapt the bedrock of Western storytelling.
And yet, through it all, from squashing a bug in a black and white apartment, to editing a memory backward, to dropping a camera into a black hole, his ultimate obsession has never changed.
If you want a final thought to mull over, consider this. Christopher Nolan's ultimate magic trick isn't his practical effects, or his massive IMAX cameras, or even flipping a real semi-truck in Chicago. His greatest trick is that he has successfully hacked the human perception of time.
That is so true.
In our real lives, time only moves forward unstoppably. We are trapped in that linear clock we talked about at the beginning. But inside a dark theater, watching a Nolan film, we are freed from that prison. We can move backward. We can pause. We can layer time on top of itself, stretching seconds into centuries. He hasn't just made movies. He has given us a temporary cure for mortality.
And that wraps our spotlight on Christopher Nolan. If you enjoyed this deep dive, follow roll credits and share it with your fellow movie fans. And let us know which filmmaker, actor, or actress we should spotlight next. We'll be back soon with more trivia, more movie magic, and next time, we may even set sail into Nolan's epic vision of the Odyssey.